Great-looking renders don't just happen by luck. They happen when you know exactly what you're doing. I'm going to read you a short paragraph right now, and then I'll read it again at the very end of this video. But trust me, by the time we get there, you won't hear it the same way you do right now. If you fully understand it from the start, great. But if not, I suggest sticking around until the end. Back then, ambient occlusion was used mostly for lighting, especially in games like Crysis.
Maximum speed.
But nowadays, ambient occlusion is used more for texturing rather than faking light, especially in movies and animation, because with ray tracing and modern hardware, computers can handle lighting much better and faster than in the old days. In games though, ambient occlusion is still used for both texturing and lighting. Yes, today we're talking about ambient occlusion or AO, one of those magical tricks that can instantly take your renders to the next level.
I have a secret. I'm a trigamio multiplayer, and I pick all three of you! Are you excited?
Back in 2007, AO made its first big breakthrough in the history of computer graphics with Crysis, becoming a true game changer. It shocked everyone with how realistic the visuals looked compared to other games at the time. And since then, it's been used across every industry from games to animation to movies. But here's the catch. AO is also one of the most misused tools out there, especially by beginners. You can't just turn it on everywhere and call it a day. Used wrong, it won't just fail to improve your render, it can actually ruin it. Worse, it'll make it obvious to everyone that you're not a pro yet. So in this episode, you'll finally understand what AO really is, when to use it, when to avoid it, and how to use it like a pro, by testing it on different examples so you can clearly see its real use cases. Alright, let's start with the basics. Ambient occlusion, or AO, is a non-physically based shading and rendering technique used in 3D graphics to approximate how much ambient or indirect light reaches a given point on a surface. It simulates the soft shadows that appears in creases, corners, and where objects are close together, areas where light is naturally occluded or blocked, by calculating how exposed the point is to its surroundings. While it's not based on physically accurate light transport and does not simulate actual light bouncing like global illumination, AO enhances realism by darkening these occluded areas, adding a sense of depth. AO is best understood as a multi-purpose tool that functions as a rendering pass, a texture input, and a visual enhancement technique across both shading and lighting workflows. It can be implemented as a real-time rendering effect, a baked texture map for game assets, or as a separate render pass in production pipelines. It is also widely used in texturing as a mask to enhance material detail, control dirt, grunge, wear, or adding shading variation. So yes, AO is both a rendering trick, a shading effect, a texture map, and a lighting approximation, all rolled into one handy tool. Okay, before we start, let's dive in and get comfy with some important terms. Direct illumination, indirect illumination, and global illumination. Take this room, for example. I know, it's totally dark right now. Then light enters the room, let's say from the sun shining through the window. You see it lights up just the part it hits directly. That's called direct illumination. And it's not very heavy to calculate in rendering. But indirect illumination, that one's a different story. It needs way more processing power. Indirect illumination is the light created by all those bouncing rays that originally came from the direct light source. So light rays don't just stop after hitting something. They bounce off in different directions based on the surface they hit. And they keep bouncing again and again, basically an infinite number of times. But each time they bounce, they lose a bit of energy and get dimmer. That's why the parts of the room that don't get direct light aren't pitch black. They still get some light from all those bounces. So this kind of soft lighting from indirect rays is called indirect illumination. And the glow it creates around the room is what we call ambient light. And it's in that ambient light where soft shadows appear, in corners, cracks, and places where objects are close together. So direct light plus indirect light together equals to global illumination. Render engines like Cycles try to simulate this exactly. They used a method called path tracing to calculate how light bounces in the scene. But here's the catch. Light in the real world bounces millions of times in complex ways. Even with modern computers, simulating all of that is impossible in a reasonable time. That's why path tracer render engines use tricks to calculate just enough of those bounces, enough to make the scene look realistic to our eyes. But hey, we can cheat even more by skipping indirect lighting altogether, since it's super expensive to compute. But then, how do we deal with those dark areas so they don't end up pitch black? This is where ambient occlusion comes in. Back in the day, when computers weren't as powerful as they are now, the world of computer graphics was full of cheats, fakes, and clever tricks, all to simulate reality faster and more efficiently. Direct light was pretty simple to calculate, but indirect light, that was the problem, because to make it look right, you'd need tons of light bounces, and that made the rendering super heavy. And here's the interesting part. The clue to solving this problem was actually hidden in those areas lit by ambient light. Instead of calculating all that complex indirect lighting, they come up with a shortcut. They just skipped it entirely. Here's what they did. When direct light hit an object, they would cancel the rest of the calculations for indirect light and simply fill the scene with a constant ambient light, a soft light coming from all directions, not from any specific source. But this caused a new problem. Everything looked flat and lifeless. There was no subtle shadows in corners, no contrast where surfaces met, no sense of depth. That's when the idea of AO was born. Instead of trying to calculate real light bounces, AO says, this corner is tight. Probably less light can reach here. Let's darken it a bit. It's just a smart guess based on geometry. The result? Those beautiful soft shadows in crevices and corners that make everything feel grounded and real. A clever trick to fake indirect lighting, add depth, and make scenes look more realistic without the heavy processing. Now here's the dark side of AO. AO doesn't actually understand your scene's real lighting, materials, or even colors. It's blind to them. And because of that, if you use it carelessly, it can make your render look worse instead of better. Based on everything we've covered so far, you should already know why AO can sometimes make your render worse. And if you do, great. But if not, let me say it again so it really sticks. That's because AO is just an approximation, not a physically accurate lighting simulation. It just works based on how close objects are to each other. Because of that, even the areas that are supposed to be lit by direct light, AO still darkens them. So here's the golden rule. If AO is darkening an area that's already well lit by direct light, it breaks realism. Fixing this is what separates beginners from pros. You must mask out AO in those well-lit zones, or better, use it carefully alongside your lighting. Before we move on, if ray tracing or path tracing aren't crystal clear to you, I highly recommend watching this video. It's a game changer. And I mean it. Take this seriously. The creators put in a huge amount of effort and it's pure gold. I'm not getting paid to promote them. I'm telling you because it's that valuable. Over 1.1 million people have already watched it. And if you're not one of them, you really should help push that number up. If you're serious about working in 3D, this video will supercharge your understanding of rendering, lighting, materials, everything. Alright, let's get back to it. Cycles is a physically accurate path tracing engine. It already calculates indirect lighting by default. And we naturally get that nice soft darkening in the corners, the real thing. So why would we still want to use ambient occlusion? Simple, artistic control. Sometimes realism isn't enough. You want mood, you want drama, you want depth. AO lets you dial up or down the contrast in corners and folds, even if reality wouldn't do it. It's used to enhance atmosphere, emotion, and style. Horror scene? Crank up the AO to feel trapped. Sunny ad scene? Soften the AO to feel fresh and open. AO is also essential in clay renders, but no textures or lights exist to show off details in models. It makes creases, folds, and small sculpted features pop, perfect for character turntables or modeling breakdowns. And in texturing, AO becomes a powerful mask. Artists use it to add dust in corners, dirt between objects, edge wear, seamless blending between objects from different scenes. It's like a secret layer of depth used behind the scenes to tell a richer story. Okay, now that you know what ambient occlusion is and how it works, let's see how to actually use it in Blender the right way. We can use ambient occlusion in two main ways. At the scene level, or at the object or mesh level. Object level AO is when you use it through the shader editor inside the material of an object. This way, you can apply AO separately to any object you want. Scene level AO is found in View Layer Properties under the Light section. When you enable Ambient Occlusion there, it's calculated for the whole scene. It also becomes available as a render pass, which means you can use it later in the compositing stage. Both methods have their pros and cons, so which one you use really depends on your needs. Alright, let's start with using AO through the shader editor. The first use case, adding extra depth to your model and making details pop up for presentation. That's actually why many clay renders are made, to clearly show the model's form. For example, take a look at this model. My render engine is set to cycles right now, and the only light in the scene is a soft default ambient light from the Word properties. Cycles is processing the light physically accurately, and these soft shadows you see are all thanks to path tracing. But we still can't really see all the details clearly. The model feels kind of flat. If I add just a single light from above, you can see it already helps us understand the shape better. But now, let's add an ambient occlusion node and connect it straight to the base color. Look at that. All the details just pop right out. Nothing can hide anymore. Of course, right now it's way too strong. If I lower the distance property to about 0.1, the effect becomes sharper and sticks closer to the contact areas and looks better. Just compare the before and after. Before it looked completely flat, and now with AO, there's so much more depth to the model. Alright, now let's go through each property of Ambient Occlusion node, and I'll show you examples of how each one works. The first one is color input. Whatever you plug into this, for example, your base color texture, it multiplies that with the AO result and sends it out through the color output. But there is a big limitation here. With this method, you have no control over the AO contrast. That's why, for more control, I like to hold Ctrl-Shift, then right-click and drag to connect both the base color and the AO to a mix color node. Then crank the factor up all the way and change the blend mode from mix to multiply. This gives you exactly the same result as before, but now both the base color and the AO are separate, so you've got maximum control over each one. For example, I can add a color ramp here, and by dragging the black color stub to the right, I can increase the AO contrast easily. Okay, next one is normal input, which is very simple. This is when you want AO to also use data from your normal map for its shading and calculation. By default, AO uses the surface normals, which are like tiny arrows pointing straight out from each point on the surface to decide where to check for occlusion. But if you connect a different normal map or a custom normal vector here, the AO will use those directions instead. The AO output is straightforward too. No matter what you plug into the color input, this output will only give you the AO as a grayscale result. Okay, next is the distance input, which is pretty self-explanatory, but also important. This controls how far Blender looks from each surface point to check for occlusion. If you set a small value, AO will only darken areas where surfaces are very close together, so the effect will be tight and limited to small creases. If you set a large value, AO will also darken areas that are farther apart, making the shading spread wider. And distance becomes even more interesting when you combine it with the inside option turned on, especially with very small distance values. The inside checkbox changes how ambient occlusion is calculated. Normally, when it's off, Blender checks outward from each point on the surface to see how much it's blocked by nearby geometry. That's what gives us those dark shadows in crevices and corners. But when you turn on inside, Blender checks inward instead. This makes it darken areas that are more exposed, like outer edges or corners, rather than inner cracks. Just keep in mind, this is not the same as inverting the result. It doesn't flip the black and white values. It simply changes where Blender looks for occlusion. And as you can see, it's great for masking outer edges to add scratches, edge wear, or dust. You can also connect a grayscale texture to the distance input. For example, if I plug in a noise texture, you see this breaks up the smooth AO gradient and creates a more random look across the surface. Alright, now let's use the technique we just learned to bring a bit of life and story to the scene, which right now looks pretty dull and concrete. We're going to do something really simple. Using the AO as a mask, we'll add a layer of sand to the scene. The idea is to set up a procedural system, so later on, if we add any other object, the sand will automatically react to it and gather around it. First, I'll select the barrier. In the shader editor, I'll select all of its material nodes except the texture coordinate, mapping, and material output nodes, and group them with Ctrl-G. Once you do this, Blender automatically jumps you inside the group. So I'll press Tab to exit. Okay, now all those nodes are safely inside one group. I'm going to rename this group to Barrier Mat. Okay, I'll do the same thing for this other object and call its group Ground. Now we need the third material, the sand, which we'll later mix with both of these materials. Using the AO mask, we'll make sure it only appears in the areas where the two objects touch. For this, I'll quickly create a plane as a temporary material holder. I'll give it a new material and name it something like sand. Then, using Ctrl-Shift-T, I'll load all the texture maps for the sand and click Principled Texture Setup. Just like that. Now I'll select all these sand material nodes and group them with Ctrl-G and rename the group to sand. Alright, our third material is ready and it's time to mix it with the other two. We don't need the plane anymore, so I'll delete it. Don't worry, Blender keeps the material stored, but only until you close the current session. If you haven't assigned this new material to anything and you close Blender, it'll be gone. So let's go save it quickly before that happens. Alright, I'll pick the barrier, press Shift-A, type in the name of the third material group, sand, and there it is in the Add menu. Okay, select it, and now, super simple, hold Ctrl-Shift and right-click to mix these two shaders together. Now you can see that with the factor slider, we can blend between them. 0 means we're using only the barrier material, and 1 means only the sand material. So we need to connect the mask we're going to create with AO to the factor input. Let's make it real quick. Add an ambient occlusion, and with Ctrl-Shift-Click, connect it directly to surface so we can see it. Okay, for more contrast, I'll add a color ramp and bring these color stops closer together like this. Perfect. Okay, now by adding an invert node, we flip it because we want the sand material to show up in the brighter areas of the mask. Alright, now to break up the smooth gradient look, we can use noise texture. So I'll add a noise texture node, duplicate this color ramp with Shift-D, and plug the noise texture into it. This way, we can control its contrast too. Next, hold Ctrl-Shift and right-click to mix these two, change the blending mode to multiply, and push the factor all the way up. Set the noise texture scale super low, like 0.1, crank the detail to max, and also increase the roughness. Then fine-tune the contrast again using the color ramp. And that's it. Finally, connect the vector output from the mapping node to the vector input of the noise texture. So it uses the object's UVs for mapping. Done. Our mask is ready. Easy as that. Now we can group the setup we made for the mask. So with Ctrl-G, I group these nodes, press Tab to exit the group, and name it AO mask. Okay. Finally, I connect it to the factor input of the mix shader node, and with Ctrl-Shift-Click, I hook it up to the surface so we can preview it. Okay. As you can see, the result isn't very noticeable yet. So if you look at the mask, you see we need to increase its contrast a bit. So I simply add a color ramp and crank up the contrast. Okay, now it's starting to pop a little more and the sand material is showing up better. We also need to adjust the color to match the look of sand. So I press Tab to go inside the sand material node group, add another color ramp after the base color, pick this color stop, and set it to a sandy tone. Okay. Then I slide the color stop over like this, and now it really stands out. Perfect. Now we'll do the exact same setup for the ground object. First, I press Tab to exit, select the sand material group, AO mask, and color ramp nodes, and Ctrl-C to copy them. I select the ground object, and Ctrl-V to paste them in. Then, with Ctrl-Shift right-click, I mix them together and connect the mask to the factor input of the mix shader node. Now I'll just move this color stop a bit over. Nice. Now to control the dust on the ground, we can click on this value so the AO mask works separately for this object compared to the barrier. Then by pressing Tab, we can go inside the group, and here By moving the color stops on the color ramp nodes, we can control how much the dust spreads across the ground. Okay, once we're done, we can press Tab again to exit the group. And that's it. See how quickly we could apply this setup to another object? And the great thing is, it works in a procedural way. For example, if I add another object, like a cube, you can see both materials react to it. Like sand is gathering around the cube. And instead of cube, it could be anything, like these trash bags. Awesome! Now we've learned how to use AO to make Blender dirty. Anything we add to the scene will instantly get dusty. Just remember, if you want the sand to affect a newly added object, you need to apply this setup to that object too. See how even this tiny detail can make the whole scene feel more alive? It's like a sandstorm came through, and the sand got stuck right where the barrier meets the ground. So, once again, we've seen the real strength of ambient occlusion. It's one of the best tools for those moments when you want to show that an object has been sitting untouched in a corner for years. Using AO as a mask, we can tell a story, showing what's happened in those hidden spots. Maybe dust has gathered, rust has spread, moss has kept in, or the paint has slowly faded away. That's why nowadays, instead of faking lighting with it, AO is mostly used for masking. Of course, I should mention, in game engines like Unreal Engine or Unity, AO is still often used to fake lighting, and that's much more common there. Alright, now let's quickly move on to the second way to access AO, using Render Pass. For this method, go to the View Layer Properties tab, then under Passes, and then Light, you'll find the option to enable Ambient Occlusion. If you head over to Compositing and click Use Nodes, you'll see that when AO is enabled in the View layer, a new output socket called AO appears on the Render Layer node. Right now, it's just an empty socket, but once you render the scene, if you switch the Compositing to View layer, you'll be able to see all the passes you've enabled. In my case, I've only enabled AO, so here I have Combined, which is the mix of all passes, and AO. If I select AO, you can see it's been calculated for the entire scene and given to us as a separate pass or layer. So AO is calculated at the scene level. Just remember, it's not applied to the scene. Even if AO pass was turned off, the final render result would still be exactly the same. The difference is that now we have AO as an extra layer of data to use later in compositing, and we'll see how that works in just a bit. In the Eevee render engine, when you enable the AO pass, you'll also see a distance slider pop up, which lets you control its range. In Cycles, we don't have this slider, so we can't change the AO distance. So the key difference between the mesh level and scene level methods is this. With the mesh level method, through the material, we could have AO calculated separately for each object. And with the only local option, we could even make it ignore other objects in the scene. But with the scene level method, through view layers, we don't have that much control. The calculation applies to the whole scene. So which method is better depends on your project's needs. Now let's move on to compositing and see how we can use the AO render pass. I'll press V a few times to zoom out the view a bit. You can also zoom in with Alt V if you want. Okay, let's select this connection and press X to delete it for now. Now with Ctrl-Shift left-click on this node, we can send the output we want directly to the viewer node. You can see this is our final render. And if I Ctrl-Shift-click it twice more, you see this is our AO output. It's super simple. We just need to multiply these two together with a mix color node. So I'll add one, connect them to its inputs, then Ctrl-Shift-click the mix color node to send it to the viewer node. Okay, I'll set the factor to the maximum and change the blending mode to multiply. And just like that, you can see the AO is combined with our render. One thing to note, the AO render pass can sometimes be a bit noisy. That's why you can add a denoise node here to clean it up before using it. Another thing, AO's default strength is usually a bit too high. So we can add a color ramp here, and by brightening the black color stop, we can reduce its intensity. The brighter it gets, the weaker the AO becomes. We can also adjust the contrast if you want. And that's it. Finally, you can select the viewer node, press N, and in the side panel under the Node tab, click Save this image to save your result in your desired format. Alright, that's it. Now let's go back to the paragraph from the start of the video. Your understanding of it should be completely different now. Back then, ambient occlusion was used mostly for lighting. especially in games like Crysis. But nowadays, ambient occlusion is used more for texturing rather than faking light, especially in movies and animation, because with ray tracing and modern hardware, computers can handle lighting much better and faster than in the old days. In games though, ambient occlusion is still used for both texturing and lighting.